Like it looks. Oh, hello. Welcome to Trail Talk. Sorry about that. Talking kind of to myself. But anyway, thank you so much for joining us today. We are live at the Chisholm Trail Heritage Center in Duncan, Oklahoma. And we're in our classroom studio today. And we're going to talk about the Oklahoma statehood movement. And yeah, it says part one. The promo wasn't really clear about that, but once I got into everything, you know me, I have a lot of more information than we could ever possibly cover in one episode. So we're going to drag this out for a few episodes. And today we're going to talk about Indian Territory. Now, I think that we've talked about Indian Territory a few times in the past. This is just, I wouldn't call it a different angle, but it is, it just has some additional information that I know that I haven't shared before. So, first of all, the U.S., the United States before the Louisiana Purchase. So, in the late 18th century, 1776, we become a nation. And so we have our 13 colonies. And when people went west of the Appalachian Mountains, they thought they were moving far west. People knew there was land, much more land in what we now call the United States, but no one had explored it. No one from, as in the people, the governments who were involved in this people settling here, there'd been explorers and from other countries all those years before, but centuries before actually. But around the turn of the 19th century was when people really started moving westward, even more so. And we have even some names of some territories: the Indiana Territory, the unorganized territory. I think that's interesting. And then the Mississippi Territory down here, down south. And I don't know if you can kind of tell or not. This is down here, that's Louisiana. It's kind of hard to see on the map. Of course, this is going to be Florida, the Gulf, and then there's Louisiana. So Mississippi is, essentially right here. But this is what's called Mississippi Territory at the time. So then the United States negotiated the Louisiana Purchase. And of course, when we take on the Louisiana Purchase, we know, of course, here is Louisiana, that part I just pointed out. But then we have this massive area of land that is going to require a great deal of exploration and gathering of information. And so we know the Lewis and Clark expedition they went the Mississippi, then they got onto the Missouri River, and then they came, all the way out here far. They went a long way, but they saw a great deal of the land, and so they were able to come back and report that the Mississippi River had become the western boundary of the United States. And now we have land much further west of the Mississippi River. And the middle part, it's very interesting. The middle part of this became known as the Great American Desert. Today, we call it the Great Plains. But it was thought that the Great American Desert was essentially uninhabitable. But now, we know the Great Plains is vast farmland. It's farmland now. It was grazing land, of course, for bison in those days. But the fact that it became such an area that farmers desired because of its flatness and the not a lot of trees and just an easier place to farm, as opposed to what people had been accustomed to living here, this seemed like a desert wasteland to them. We're glad that it turned out to not be that way. But President Thomas Jefferson had this idea of creating something that was more kind of an Indian colonization zone. And he wasn't the only one who thought this was a good idea, but it was essentially envisioned that the land to the west of the Mississippi would become known as Indian country. And then, so Native American people who had lived in these areas here, some of them just on their own kind of started moving westward. But people like Thomas Jefferson and later John Quincy Adams, and then, of course, a little bit later, Andrew Jackson, we know that they really liked this idea of moving the Native Americans west to the west side of the Mississippi River, really thinking, well, I have read before that Jefferson actually thought it would take like 1,000 years for people to actually move and inhabit all of what we now call the United States. In reality, this purchase was in 1803, and just a little over 100 years later, Oklahoma becomes the 46th state in the United States. So it was pretty dang fast, a lot faster than what he thought it was going to be. At any rate, the idea of moving the Indians out of these eastern states, particularly the southeastern states, into this Indian country area became quite popular. There was actually a Baptist missionary named Isaac McCoy who was the first to actually write Indian country or on something, and that's kind of how it became took on that name. So the Indian country or Indian territory would eventually encompass the present states of Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, and part of Iowa. So if we look at this, here we have Indian country, and we can see here's essentially Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, part of Iowa. Now it did go even further west, but you might notice, the many phases of Texas. Here they are under Spanish rule. Now they're under the Mexican rule. There are many countries that owned and ruled them. So the Indian removal process had begun by treaty as early as 1800, believe it or not. And some of the Cherokee had actually agreed to move. They were in South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, and they had agreed to move to the west side of the Mississippi River, which is actually over here. But Missouri and Louisiana are states. Let's see if we have Arkansas became a state in 1838. Well, this says 1834. It must be when this map was made. But some of the Cherokee began moving west in the 1810s. Now, this is something that we teach and kind of track here because Jesse Chisholm, who the Chisholm Trail is named for, is part Cherokee. And he says he came with his mother's people, and they settled here in Arkansas territory. And he was born roughly 1803, about the time of the Louisiana Purchase. So he remembers coming when he was a boy to Arkansas. And there was something called Lovely's Purchase and Arkansas territory. So this is where some kind of clashes start really happening, because particularly the Cherokee and the Choctaw have agreed to move to this smaller version of Indian territory. But there were white settlers who were coming west also, crossing the Mississippi. That's how Arkansas becomes a territory. Missouri becomes a state. Louisiana becomes a state. Well, this little strip right here was a part of Lovely's purchase, and it includes a portion of the Cherokee land and the Choctaw land. Well, those tribes were not happy with that they're surrounded by white settlers on these three sides. Texas is a state. Well, Texas is probably not a state at this time, but it's a territory owned by Mexico at the very least. So the Western Cherokee were very upset by this. And then the whites that settled, they kept moving the line that was supposed to be Arkansas territory. And so in 1828, this was resurveyed generally along the present Oklahoma-Arkansas boundary. And so that is this line right here. So if we jump to this next map, so from 1820 to roughly 1854, this is where we can see the Indian Removal Act has taken place. We have the Cherokee Outlet, Cherokee Strip, however you want to call this. The Creek and Seminole are here, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Cherokee, and this is Chickasaw and Choctaw territory over here. This is a part that was in dispute with this Lovely's purchase, but eventually that was, of course, this became Arkansas's boundary, and they're over here now. So that all that land was essentially given to back to the Choctaw and the Cherokee. So the in an 1834 Trade Act defined Indian country as all that part of the United States west of the Mississippi River and not within the states of Missouri, Louisiana, or Arkansas Territory, or any other organized territory. Whites were carefully excluded from the region, and trade by them with Indians was heavily regulated. The northern region, this part up here, which became Kansas, was attached to Missouri, and the southern part was attached to Arkansas. And that 1835 was when Isaac McCoy wrote the Indian Territory the first time. So here we can see the other three of the five civilized tribes are also removed and brought here. So by 1840, the Indian Territory had been populated sparsely by native groups, but was not a formal or organized territory, even though they called it Indian Territory. Now, this is a very important thing to know and understand. This is called Indian Territory, and yet it is never actually recognized as a true territory. And we're going to get into what determines what a real territory is. So this next map, takes us from 1855 to 1865. So this is before, during, and after the Civil War. So there was, in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was formally organized the parts of Indian Territory into official territories that afterward became states. Kansas, Nebraska, all of that. And if I'm not mistaken, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was the one that said that for every free state added to the Union, a slave state had to be added to the Union. And so there was that whole balance, because prior to the Civil War, there were a lot of people already had very strong feelings about whether or not they agreed that slavery was an acceptable institution or not. So the, let's see. So in the Indian Territory, we have, not just these tribes, the 5 civilized tribes, but we also have the Kiowa, Comanche, Apache, and after the Civil War, let's see here. So after the Civil War, we see how the land distribution has changed significantly, based partly on the fact that the 5 civilized tribes were divided themselves, as to whether or not they wanted to support the North or the South during the Civil War. Many fought during the war. They fought on opposing sides. It's interesting that among the Native Americans, it was as things played out much as they did with other people living in the country, where literally brother fought against brother because of their ideals about concerning slavery and secession from the Union and all of those things. So we have of course, we have the different colors, but we have small tribes with land up in here. We have the Osage, which the Osage were up in Kansas for years. They had amazing farmland, and so the settlers wanted that farmland. So the Osage famously said, okay, we'll take this land in the Indian Territory because it had so many rocks and things, and they knew that they would never steal that land from them because it wasn't good farmland. And then lo and behold, if it wasn't some of the richest oil reserves ever found, and so the Osage became incredibly wealthy. So it's like it just didn't matter. No matter where they lived or what their land was like, someone else always wanted what they had. The thing that was helping them to live in the white man's world, to be financially independent, essentially. So anyway, so when a specifically defined part of the unorganized federal domain was sufficiently populated, this is the explanation of becoming a territory. Its residents, United States citizens, this is in parentheses, and this is the crux of this whole situation. They could petition Congress for territorial status. Congress would subsequently pass an organic act and with a Bill of Rights for territory residents and set up a 3-part government with appointed executive and judicial branches. Residents elected a legislative branch. The federal government had ultimate authority over territorial affairs, and an elected territorial representative was seated in Congress. Congress never passed an organic act for Indian Territory. Although a few measures were proposed, one bill was written for that purpose. The region never had a formal government, and it remained unorganized. Therefore, the geographic location commonly called Indian Territory was not actually a territory. So, first reason, the whole United States citizens thing, it was not until the land allotments happened where the first land run happened in 1889 in this area that was unassigned to any Native American tribe. The following land runs, land was allotted to the Native American people who lived on these reservations. But instead of this being land owned by the tribe, it was land is owned by you. They were given allotments of 40, 80, or 160 acres, depending on if it was a child or adult, a woman, things like that. So, all of the land that was left over after the allotments was essentially purchased by the government. And then the money was paid out to all of the citizens of that tribe by just literally dividing the number of acres divided by the number of people living in that area belonging to that tribe times whatever dollar figure or cent figure. I read that some of it sold for 59 cents an acre, 58 cents an acre, something absolutely ridiculous, right? Yeah. And so each person would get a small amount of money for, so they go from owning all of this area communally to owning plots of land, the largest of which is 160 acres. So they were not United States citizens. And so, and then the way they became United States citizens, I lost my train of thought. The way they became citizens was by agreeing to the allotment. And once they agreed to that, sold off the rest of their land, then they could become a US citizen. Right? I don't like the way all that happened. Okay, so soon the area was reduced again, and it became, this is Oklahoma territory and this is Indian territory. So the tribes on this side did not immediately do the allotment situation. The tribes over here did. The first, well, this is after but the first land run happened like about this area right here. These have county names assigned to them because Oklahoma Territory, it was no longer land that belonged to the Native Americans. It was allotted land and then land given through these land runs. Greer County, this dispute over this land had to be settled by the US government. Texas thought they should have it, but in the end, Oklahoma got that. The Panhandle, no man's land, was added to Oklahoma Territory. Interesting story about the Cherokee Outlet. I know I talked about this in another trail talk at least 2, maybe 3 years ago, where this land belonged to the Cherokee people, but they didn't really live there. They lived more over here in this area. And so they leased out grazing land to ranchers. And they did that on their own. They were very business minded and had these agreements, these leases, and all of these things. And they were making a great amount of money supporting their tribe. It was a wonderful business situation for them. And then the government kind of got wind of this and made it stop, basically. And they ended up ceding this land for, well, the fourth land run. This land was given out during the fourth land run. So, Oklahoma Territory, once the land runs begin happening, this is set up as an actual territory. This still is not. It's called Indian Territory, but it's never given true territorial status. Oklahoma Territory, though, there's an Organic Act passed in May of 1890. A governor was appointed, a 2-house territorial assembly and judicial system was set up. A bona fide territory of the United States, Oklahoma Territory would be eligible for statehood if its population grew large enough and if its leaders followed the process prescribed by federal law. This is how every state became a state, probably after the 13 colonies thing. I'm not sure when the Organic Act territorial thing, when that came to be, but this is the process to become a state. So the Oklahoma Territory Organic Act even more closely defined Indian Territory, reducing it slightly more than the eastern half of the present state. In the 1905 Sequoia Convention, Indian leaders sought to bypass the territorial process and bring about separate statehood for Indian Territory. I have more information on some of this, but I mean, even though they attempted to create the state of Sequoia here, they ran into some issues because these tribal leaders weren't really willing to give up control. They still want, not in a bad way, they just wanted to keep their tribal lands governed by their tribe. I mean, you can kind of see where they were coming from. The 1907 Union of Indian and Oklahoma Territory became the state of Oklahoma, of course. So the big thing that really pushed this to becoming a state was the way the population grew after the first land run in 1889. And then everything that followed after that. So we can kind of see we're working towards statehood. We're not there yet, but the setup, the way Indian Territory was put together, the way Indian Territory was not acknowledged as being a territory, just the way that, well, there were so many things that took place that became the fact that the Native American people who had once covered the United States, living far and wide, how, where they wanted, because that's where their people had lived for generations and generations. One could even argue since the beginning of time that they had lived here, and now it's reduced to these very small areas. And then over here it's still communal land. Over here it's allotments, little 40, 80, or 160 acre plots of land. I mean, it's crazy to think about how fast all of that happened. And I mean, here we are, Oklahoma is a state, and I'm grateful for that fact. I love being here and being from Oklahoma. I love everything about Oklahoma. Well, most everything about Oklahoma. But anyway, I still, when I think about this and how all this came about. Anyway, there's so much more that we're going to be learning, more details about Indian Territory and about the Native American people and some of their opinions and the way they handled some of the situations that came about. But this is a great place to stop for part one. And I hope you'll join us again next week, because we're going to dive in and go to part two. A little side note, we talked up the paranormal activity and everything happening last week. Well, there was a illness and they didn't get to come, but they're going to reschedule. So just know we will be finding out about the paranormal activity here at the Chisholm Trail Heritage Center. But until then, I hope you guys have a great rest of your week and weekend, and I'll see you next time. And until then, happy trails. Bye-bye.